I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and it is my great good fortune to be hanging out with a writer I have known for more than a minute. He's been writing for a while, and I've been a bookseller for a while, and now we get to hang out. We've been meaning to do this event for a really long time. The Jackal's Mistress is Chris Bohjalian's 25th novel. 25 novels. All right. And so those of you who have read Chris's work know that we've just come from present-day Vegas with a Princess Diana impersonator. Then before that, also, we went to the Serengeti in 1964 with some actors who were behaving badly in the midst of many, many other things. But call that like an Agatha Christie locked room mystery on the Serengeti, right? And then we go back to the BN Book Club pick from 2021, Hour of the Witch, where there's only one person who can pull off putting together witchcraft, Massachusetts in the 1680s, and I say this as a refugee from Massachusetts, and divorce. But of course he does it. So we might bounce back and forth between all of these recent pubs, because Chris has always said this in interviews, that I don't ever want to write the same book twice. So why don't we start there? Let's start about, because you've been thinking about the Jackal's Mistress for a really long time.
I have. First of all, Miwa, it is such a pleasure to be back on Poured Over. I love this podcast, a podcast all about books, and you are a rock star.
Oh,
so thank you.
Thank you. My publicist.
No.
I just really like being a bookseller, and I really like hanging out with writers. That's kind of all it comes down to.
And isn't this fun to be in a bookstore?
Oh, so good.
The Jackal's Mistress is a Civil War Romeo and Juliet that actually had its origins way back in 2003 when I wrote a story for Reader's Digest. And it wasn't one of, the dramas in real life. It was a historical piece about a abolitionist in the Vermont Brigade who is gravely wounded in the Shenandoah Valley in 1864, left for dead, and the wife of a rebel soldier who makes a decision to keep him alive, deciding that if her husband were dying far from home in Maryland or Pennsylvania, she would want a Yankee woman, coarse as that Yankee woman might be, to do what she could for her husband.
Right.
So despite the fact that it is treasonous, it is dangerous, it is an area of the Shenandoah Valley where John Mosby's Confederate Rangers are hanging George Armstrong Custer's cavalrymen, and Custer's cavalrymen are hanging Confederate soldiers. She decides she's going to try and hide him, heal him, and if she can, bring him back across the Confederate lines.
And that was the piece that got me as I was reading The Jackal's Mistress. I was like, okay, I get the let's keep him alive. Let's have this not on our conscience, right? And I get I'm not really in lockstep with my neighbors. I live in this world, right? It was the getting him home part where I was like, oh, now I'm really interested. Because this is the piece of the story that I didn't feel like, and I say this as I may have worked on a book called Cold Mountain back in the day when I was a baby publicist. So I may have a little familiarity with some of this. But the idea that this woman was just like, yep, I'm going to do a thing. And y'all can come along or not, but I'm going to do the thing. And that's where I was like, oh, I am in. I am completely, completely in. But I want to talk about character because, you write women in a way that not every guy writer does.
Okay, my favorite review of all time is a Library Journal review of Midwives going back to 1996 before it is published. It ends with this paragraph. An added benefit of Bohjalian's novel is the candor and the honesty with which she writes about her experiences in labor and what it must have been like for her to give birth.
Okay.
Favorite review? I can also tell you my worst reviews, too.
Well, you know what? We don't actually have to share space with them right now. They may exist, but we don't have to share space. So I want to go back, though, to this idea that you bounce between and not in this book, right? I'm talking body of work in this case. But that you bounce between the present day and deep I mean, technically the 80s are historical fiction. I'm still a little weirded out by that. I am not fully prepared to admit that that's true. But here you are. I mean, you slide 200 years in either direction, and you're fine.
I am. And it wasn't until 2022, speaking of moving back and forth in time, that I realized this Reader's Digest story I had written 19 years earlier had relevance. If ever our country needed a novel about healing and hope and a path forward that doesn't involve meanness, cruelty, pettiness, and stupidity, it might be the story of these two remarkable people with wildly different world views suddenly in a locked room together. A rebel woman and a Yankee abolitionist. And one of the wonderful things about historical fiction, well, there are actually two things I love about it.
Okay.
The first is this. I can make stuff up. David McCullough couldn't make stuff up.
This is true.
I love that. True. But the other thing about historical fiction is that people will read about things that they would not read in a history. And I learned this with my novel, The Sandcastle Girls, about the Armenian genocide. No one would have ever read a memoir of my grandparents surviving the Armenian genocide. But if I put it as a love story in historical fiction, it was able to educate millions of people around the world.
Right. But speaking of education, I mean, you go deep into the research. Yes, you do make up. Yes, you get to make things up. That is the beauty of being a novelist and a dramaturg. And I mean, you have how many plays now?
3.
Yeah, see? I mean,
and,
really, we get to make up a lot of stuff.
Shout out to Amy Wagner, my play agent, who's in the house tonight. Thank you, Amy.
But I do, let's talk about research because, I mean, there is the danger when you're writing historical fiction that it gets a little homeworky and it gets a little pedantic-y because you get so excited about all the facts and it's like, well, I can't leave anything out. This is all very, very important. And then the story bogs down or the characters sound like they are standing at a podium making remarks and you're just like, oh, this is not why I read Chris Bohjalian. So how do you make the magic?
A little research goes a long way.
Okay.
And I know so much more about Civil War bone saws than I share in the novel. I know so much more about all of the ways to use whiskey in battlefield surgical operations than anyone needs to know.
Okay.
So a lot of the messaging in this particular novel comes from a 12-year-old girl named Jubilee, one of those wonderful young adults with literally no filter, who is able to look at both her aunt, who's a Confederate, and this Union abolitionist who she loathes, not because he's an abolitionist, but because he's a Yankee.
Right.
And, you know, and her dad is somewhere in a Union POW camp, and her uncle is fighting somewhere now down near Petersburg, so she's the one who calls him the Jackal. And so much of the historical messaging belongs to 12-year-old Jubilee.
I really liked her. I mean, she reminded me perhaps maybe of some other 12-year-olds I may have known. She also sounds like a 12-year-old. She doesn't sound like a 40-year-old pretending to be 12 or a 12-year-old pretending to be 40. And that does take a little zhuzhing. You do have to step outside of yourself. And even if you do want to give her sort of some ideas to play with and the freedom that an unfiltered 12-year-old has, right? Especially in a culture where everyone has their role, and when you sidestep your role, the world blows up.
Don't you just love a good smart alecky 12-year-old
Yes.
in a book? I just love smart Alex, and Jubilee's a smart aleck, but you're absolutely right. You don't want her to be wiser than her years, nor do you want her to sound like a toddler.
12-year-olds, you know, any sort of actually between 12 and 14, where you're on the cusp of great wisdom, but you have no idea that it's great wisdom because you're an adolescent. And
you're also first beginning to see that your parents aren't perfect.
Right.
Your parents are spectacularly flawed because they're human. They're going to make unbelievable parenting mistakes. For example, Jubilee at first thinks it is absolutely insane that her aunt is taking in this dying Union soldier, but not so much because it is treasonous and might get them killed, but because it means she now has to share her bedroom with her aunt.
I'd be mad.
Oh, she is.
I'd be mad. I mean, I would not be thrilled. But, I want to come back to a thread that also runs through all of, whether it's present day or historical, dread. Jubilee isn't the only one having a little bit the reader has a little bit of dread while we're experiencing all the things you put us. We're like the frog sitting in the boiling water, and we keep turning pages, and Chris keeps doing stuff.
I love dread.
Yeah, you do.
I do.
But we need to talk about dread because there's a codicil that goes with dread, but let's start with dread.
Okay. When my books work, and God knows they do not always work.
We're not here to talk about that part either. We're going to talk about the ones that work.
Okay. When they work, the books walk a tightrope between dread and character development.
Right.
And I think a lot about the differences between dread and fear. Fear, I think, is when you are fearing for yourself. Dread is when you are filled with apprehension for someone you care about. So I want my books to be filled with characters you care about. And you are filled with dread either because of something that you fear is going to happen to them, or because of an egregiously bad decision you fear they are going to make. So dread is my jam. It really is. And this goes back forever.
Oh, yeah.
My mom died when I was a young man.
Okay.
My dad died more recently.
Okay.
When I was cleaning out his apartment after he died, I came across the oldest short story in existence I ever wrote. And there are two things about it I love.
Okay.
My cursive is banger.
Okay.
And if you want to be the coolest kid on the 4th grade playground, you want to have the best penmanship, as anyone knows. But also because of how locked in place was my literary sensibilities at 9. This is the last sentence of the oldest short story in existence I ever wrote.
And?
The dripping stopped, and the vultures had their meal.
Yeah, I recognize that 9-year-old. I totally recognize that 9-year-old.
I need to use it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad. Well, Laura's wondering, though, who's your favorite protagonist out of all of this? If we're going to go all the way back to midwives, right? That was more than a minute ago. But favorite protagonist?
You know, my favorite protagonists are often my children, and often they change.
Okay.
But off the top of my head, I love Jubilee in the Jackal's Mistress. I love Connie Danforth in Midwives. I love Little Hatoun, the mute girl in the Sandcastle Girls. That's off the top of my head. I think I'm also always have a soft spot in my heart for seriously, pardon my French, badass women.
Fair enough.
Libby Stedman in The Jackal's Mistress, Mary Deerfield in Hour of the Witch, Elizabeth Endicott in The Sandcastle Girls.
Yeah. No, I recognize all of those women. Libby, though, really ahead of her time, but not in a way where I felt pulled out of the story. She really is a unique character in a lot of ways.
I loved writing about Libby. And we were talking a minute ago about how a little research goes a long way.
Yeah.
And how do you use research without hitting the reader over the head and showing off?
Right.
And so in the case of Libby, some of the ways to do that were what are the books that she reads? And what are the books that she reads in comparison to what this abolitionist Middlebury College professor is likely to read? It's one of my favorite moments to write in the book. It's sort of this lovely moment when he's healing and they're drinking together outside on the porch because it's dark out, so he can actually be outside the house. And they're talking about books. And they're going back and forth between Uncle Tom's Cabin and the Southern retaliation novel that even Libby Stedman knows is ridiculous, appalling rebel propaganda.
Right. And yet, she reads it anyway.
But dismissively.
She reads it anyway. Yeah. I'm going to give her I'm going to give her points for reading it, though,
Okay.
even if she is raising a hairy eyebrow going, yeah, I could make better choices. But part of the fun, too, with historical fiction is you've still got to ground it in something that's recognizable. I mean, these people, we know who they are even though they've been dead for a really long time, right? No cell phones, no maps, and you still give us basically a kind of a caper flick.
Oh, I love that. That's brilliant. Thank you.
I do what I can.
Okay, that's my new elevator pitch, the Civil War caper flick.
It kind of is.
Yeah.
It kind of is.
I mean, yes, she has to not merely keep him alive. She then has to figure out how in the name of God is she going to get him through the Confederate lines back to the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry.
Which in this day and age, I mean, that may as well be Mars.
It is 20 miles, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's 20 miles filled with Jubal Early's Confederate Army, John Mosby's Confederate Rangers, and all of the deserters from the Confederate Army who you meet at different points in the novel.
So you've been working on this book, though, since 2000. Let's call it on and off 2003. You've been thinking about it. You've been putting it away, picking it up. But
no.
No, you just put it away? It just hung out in a drawer?
I didn't write one word of it as a novel after the article appeared in Reader's Digest.
Okay.
Cut to 2022, and I'm in Richmond, Virginia on the Lioness Book Tour, and you really feel the weight of the Civil War in Richmond in ways that you don't here in New York City or in Vermont where I live.
Right.
The closest thing Vermont had to a Civil War battle was a botched bank robbery near the Canadian border in St. Albans.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like part of the plot.
Nope. But in Richmond, Virginia, especially in 2022, I could really get a sense of the Civil War.
Right.
And I wanted to see Monument Avenue, where all of the statues of the treasonous Confederate generals, Jefferson Davis too, had just been pulled down.
Right.
And that's when it really clicked. Why have I not written a novel about these two remarkable people with moral compasses that are inspiring and authentic and maybe, just maybe, what we need now?
You like that pairing, that collision of ideas. I'm going to go back to Vegas for a second. And I'm going to ask you guys to humor me because he's the guy who wrote the book about Vegas. But Princess Diana and the mob, and yes, a Princess Diana impersonator, and her sister, who also looks like, still grounded in reality. It's the collision of two ideas, right? It's celebrity, it's Vegas, it's royalty, it's all of these things, and yet this is what you followed up with.
I take great pride in one weird footnote to the Princess of Las Vegas.
Okay.
When I was writing this book, I had people telling me, why in the name of God would you put a Princess Diana impersonator in Las Vegas? And about 6 months before the book opened, the only Princess Diana museum in America opened in, wait for it, Las Vegas.
Can't make it up.
Yeah. And when I was
Cannot make this up.
I mean, Vegas is such a weird, wild, wonderful world. When I was researching the novel in 2021, we are, now getting our first vaccinations against COVID.
Oh, I remember.
But COVID's still a thing.
Yep.
So my first morning in Vegas, I am going down to breakfast through the casino, and the slot machines are filled with people who are wearing masks that they have cut holes in so they can get their cigarettes through the mask at the slot machines.
I have seen these photos. But I do love the idea that there's you in Vermont. You get an idea. Maybe you chase it. Maybe it goes in a drawer. But this range and this idea that you always have something you need to say about the present, whether it's historical fiction or whatever. But how do you surprise yourself? This is your 25th book. You've been doing this for more. How do you still surprise yourself?
My characters surprise me. I really don't surprise myself, at least not consciously. Whenever I'm stalled in the morning when I'm writing, whenever I have writer's block, it's usually because I haven't done my homework. I haven't learned enough about the subject to bring the characters to life.
Okay, that's fair. At what point in your writing process do you know your protagonist's gender identity, and how does it ever change as you work on the book? Or does it change?
Oh, what a lovely question. When I begin a book, I need to know two things. That's it. The vague premise. Alcoholic flight attendant wakes up next to a dead body far from home. Midwife is on trial for manslaughter. Massachusetts young woman goes into an innermost ring of Dante's Inferno, Aleppo 1915, and is shocked by the Armenian genocide. Then I need to make a decision. Is it first or third person? Do I have a voice so idiosyncratic that it's worth doing it in the first person?
Okay.
Or do I not? In which case I will usually begin in the third person, which sometimes as a novelist is way more fun, especially if you don't have a funky voice. And I can give you an example, if you don't mind going back in time to Midwives.
Let's do it.
Okay, Midwives. I have this vague premise. A midwife is on trial for manslaughter. Never written a novel from a female perspective, and it hasn't crossed my mind that this midwife novel will be narrated by a woman. I assume it's going to be written by the midwife's husband or the midwife's lawyer.
Right.
One afternoon, when my daughter's about a year old, I'm giving her a bottle at the end of the day, and I remembered an interview I'd had with a midwife's daughter, who was at the time an undergraduate at UVM, the University of Vermont, and I said, "What was it like being a midwife's kid?" And she said, "Oh, I was always the most popular kid in the sandbox," because she knew the anatomic terrain way better than all her peers. And a sentence came into my head. I used the word vulva as a child. The way some kids said butt or penis or puke, it wasn't a swear exactly, but I knew it had an edge to it that could stop adults cold in their tracks. And that sounded to me like a midwife's daughter. And so I gave myself license to fail. I would start the book narrated by the midwife's daughter, and if it wasn't working after 50 pages, I would abort mission and try it again from a guy's perspective. But it worked, and I loved it, and I loved writing across gender ever since.
That was also the Oprah pick, right?
That was also the Oprah pick.
I mean, listen, when a thing works, the thing works. I want to talk about editing for a second, too, because, again, 25th novel. Right, 25th novel. How has your editing process changed with your editor and the fact that you've been together for 15 years?
I am so blessed. People talk all about how publishing is changing. And I've been in publishing since the Mesozoic era. I mean, literally.
We are not that far off. I mean, I've been doing this book selling thing for more than a minute.
I am the oldest man on TikTok, trust me.
I'm definitely not on TikTok.
But here's how blessed I am. I have been with Penguin Random House for 30 years.
Right.
And I've only had 2 editors. I had the wonderful Shay Earhart from 1995 to 2010. And now I have the brilliant Jenny Jackson, who's been my editor since 2010. And she's not just a great editor, she's the great novelist between Pineapple Street.
And honestly, it's got to be kind of fun for you. I mean, here you are sitting in the space, working away. You hand off pages to your agent. Your agent says what they say.
Who's in the house tonight? Thank you, Deborah Schneider.
Hello. Then you get to send pages to your editor, who also understands novels at a slightly different cellular level. And I love editors. Oh, man, I love editors. But I think it's kind of fun when you get an editor who's also a novelist in their own right. I mean, that changes the dynamic a little bit, doesn't it?
No, it really, really does. And here's the main way it changes. After she finished Pineapple Street and got her own editor's notes, she said to me, "Oh my God, I can't believe what I've been doing to so many authors for so many years." It was really delightful.
Okay.
But it is great to have a novelist as an editor, because she really does understand the wiring behind the sheetrock.
Well, and the wiring behind the sheetrock, I want to talk about narrative tension for a second, because you do this thing across the books. And again, I'm going to generalize here for a second, and you'll see it. Those of you who have not yet read The Jackal's Mistress, you are going to experience it first. But this idea that you are constantly pulling us forward through, I never really felt like I was going to sit down and take a minute and catch up with you. It was kind of like, oh, wait. Oh, it's this constant sort of forward movement. That doesn't usually happen in a first pass, even with a 25th novel.
Sometimes my books are awash in autobiographic minutia that isn't necessary.
Okay.
And there are 3 really remarkably smart women in my life who are great at helping me cut the fat away. Jenny Jackson, my editor, Deborah Schneider, my agent, and my lovely bride, Victoria Bluer, who has read every single one of the 3.6 million words I have published before they were published. And
Right.
And I don't want to give the impression that I don't push back against these three women, because on occasion I do.
Right.
But as Victoria, my lovely bride, once said to me when clearly I was pushing back against a criticism, she said, "Wouldn't you rather hear it from me than the New York Times?"
She has a point. She has a point.
Yeah. Also got to give a shout out to Grace Experience, my daughter, who's
Yep.
in the house tonight and has also become one of my most important readers and a great audiobook narrator.
This is true. I can vouch for the audiobook narration part. Very, very good. Grief. I know you and I were talking about this event, sort of, yeah, I know. And don't worry, it's not going to be gruesome, I promise. But it is something I want to talk about with Chris specifically, because, you know, when you're working with a sense of dread, right, and you're working with these characters and you're letting the characters do what they're going to do, and obviously when you're writing about the Armenian genocide and civil war and other things, grief comes into it, but grief is something that does sort of flutter through. It flutters through The Lioness. It flutters through Hour of the Witch. It certainly is present in all of the early books. I mean, just everything. It is there. And I want to spend a minute with that, because no one has ever asked you. They've asked you about dread. They've asked you about surprise. They've asked you about the actual physical craft. But no one has ever said, hey, what's with the grief?
What a great question. What is with the grief? Well, first of all, I would say this. Grief is a part of the soul of the world. People far smarter than me have said all of life is saying goodbye. And I'm at a stage in my life now when I am precariously close to the end compared to where I was 10 or 20 years ago. And I'm not oblivious to that reality.
Right.
So when I'm writing a novel, I'm certainly not going to shy away from grief. Now, you can feel grief when you are on the south side of 40, just as you can on the north side of 40. And we are all, no one gets out alive, and no one gets out unbruised, and all of us were changed in some way by the pandemic. But here's what I find really, really lovely.
Yeah.
And here's one of the good news about the pandemic. Not simply that, 5 years ago we wouldn't all have been in the same room together. But we are now, which is such a gift. And we just all endured the worst pandemic since the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1920. And what followed that? Jazz, gin, dancing. I didn't wait for the pandemic to rediscover gin. Some of you might know from Hour of the Witch there's a character named Peregrine, named after my gin of choice then. But here's the other thing. In 2021, I reread Catherine Ann Porter's remarkable novella, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, about the influenza pandemic.
Right.
And it suddenly clicked. All of that literary renaissance of the 1920s, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Hemingway, Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, Catherine Ann Porter, we all assumed it was World War I that gave them their voice. But I think it was the pandemic. And now I'm seeing all of these remarkable books written in lockdown. Chain Gang All-Stars, Tom Lake, Demon Copperhead, Broken Country. It is such a long list. I mean, Fiona Davis is in the house tonight, and she's written at least 3 remarkable novels off the top of my head that have come out since 2020. And it's not just novelists.
Right.
I think we are in the midst of a great literary renaissance, but a great artistic renaissance. Every time I turn on my television, there's another streaming show that I'm thinking is spectacular.
Art will always save us. I've always believed that. I mean, you
that's my
don't
new
end up being
mantra.
you don't end up being a bookseller unless you believe in the thing that you're doing. I mean, there are easier ways. I promise you, there are easier ways to make a living. But at the same time, I mean, if you really believe in the thing, believe in the thing.
And that's why I'm so grateful to you, Miwa, and to all of the booksellers in this wonderful store. No one becomes a bookseller to get rich. People become booksellers because they care deeply about what stories can mean to the soul. And I just love what you said about art will save us.
Hey, can you explain or discuss how the Reader's Digest article was, quote, about real people? We're going back to the Jackal's Mistress for a second.
Yes. Wonderful guy named Gary Sledge, my editor at Reader's Digest back in the Jurassic Park era part of my life, way back. He called me up and said, I heard this anecdote about a guy in the Vermont Brigade who was saved by a rebel woman. You live in Vermont. Do you mind researching it? And I said, sure. That sounds interesting. And all we know about the two real people exist in this teeny little 1869 book called The Vermont Brigade in the Shenandoah Valley, and a couple of letters that Aldous Walker, the Middlebury College valedictorian 1862, wrote home, and one letter that the actual woman Betty Van Meter wrote to the Vermont State Legislature at the end of her life in 1914, because they were giving her a commendation for saving a son of Vermont.
Right.
And that's really all we knew. So it really wasn't a hard story to write. The hardest part was learning all of the things that are not in that 6-page episode in the Vermont Brigade in the Shenandoah Valley, but what's really going on in the Civil War, then what was Civil War medicine like? What was it like to be a lonely woman whose husband has been gone for years and she hasn't heard from in years? She knows he's in a prisoner of war camp, but that's it. And to be trying desperately to run her husband's grist mill with two formerly enslaved people who've remained to work the mill. It must have been harder than hell, especially because virtually every bit of food they produced, certainly all the grain they produced, was confiscated by the Army of Northern Virginia. I mean, they weren't starving the way they would be in the following winter, but it was getting dire fast, especially because the goal at this point of the Union Army in the Shenandoah Valley was to destroy the breadbasket of the Confederacy.
Right. We have cute questions that I'm putting off for a second because there's something I have been meaning to ask you for more than a minute, which is, why do you write?
I can't imagine doing anything else with my life.
Okay, that I know.
But when I was growing up, I knew I wanted to be a writer. But if I couldn't be a writer, I either wanted to be a Broadway tenor or Tom Seaver, Mets pitcher.
Okay.
Those were my goals. Writing gives, other than hanging around with my wife or my daughter or my amazing dog, there's nothing that gives me more pleasure than writing. I love riding my bike, and I'm pretty obvious about that, but riding my bike has become for me a tool to write better, because I do so much biking in the afternoon to figure out what in holy hell I'm going to write the next morning.
Okay, that's fair enough. I mean, part of it, too, and I know we keep sort of looping around it, it's you have the depth of emotion, you have the time with the story, you let the characters lead you. I mean, it seems like you're puzzling out maybe bits of your own life without necessarily putting everything on the page.
Okay, I'm about to drop the bomb. Most of my books do have unbelievable amounts of autobiographic minutiae in them. Not just a book like The Sandcastle Girls, but even a book like Skeletons at the Feast about one German family's complicity in the Holocaust is awash with scenes of one of the protagonists, Anna Emmerich, and her younger brother Theo riding horses, all of which come from the afternoons when my daughter Grace Experience and I were riding horses together. Even that is as I think it was Victoria once said to me, it's all material. Everything you do, it's all material. Okay, but here's the bombshell. The next book I have coming out is called The Amateur, and it's about a 18-year-old LPGA golf aspirant who one day before going to college drives a golf ball through the practice net at her Tony Country Club, killing a caddy instantly, derailing her life, and it is narrated by a 60-something female novelist known best for a book about a midwife on trial for manslaughter. It is filled with every weird detail from Victoria's and my young adulthood.
Okay. Speaking of your young adulthood, though, we have a moment of show and tell, and I will get back to these other questions, but I think we need to bring out the story.
We do.
We have props.
Is Laura Matthews in the house tonight?
There we go.
Where's Laura?
Over on this side here.
Hi, Laura. I amassed 250 rejection slips before I sold a single word.
Okay, this cover is going to make everyone in the room laugh. I'm sorry. It's been a really long time since I've seen a paper copy of Cosmo.
Yeah.
They did used to publish fiction.
They published great fiction.
So many magazines used to publish great fiction. So when we said we read it for the articles, we really weren't kidding. Sorry, I had to drop that in there. I'm sorry. I'm just going to sit quietly in the corner now.
No. I'm glad you brought that up. About reading the articles. I amassed 250 rejection slips before I sold a single word, writing these stories for The New Yorker, Ellery Queen, Harper's, Alfred Hitchcock, between 5 and 7 a.m. in the morning before going to work at an ad agency, and I was sending them relentlessly. And when I got number 250, I thought to myself, plan A, not working.
Okay.
Time for plan B. So I amassed 6 months' worth of cosmopolitans to really understand what constituted a cosmopolitan short story.
Okay.
And then I wrote one.
Okay.
It's about a female supermodel who lives in a spectacular downtown loft, married to a pretty moneyed guy, but their marriage is a little bit dicey. So one weekend she goes out to their equally cool beach house on Fire Island to see if the marriage can be saved, but instead spends the entire time playing scantily clad beach volleyball. Cosmopolitan bought it. And the editor, who literally started my career, is in the house tonight, Laura Matthews. And you were talking about editors making stories better.
There we go.
I gave you the elevator pitch for the story.
Okay.
It's not that bad because Laura Matthews made it better.
Okay.
And how good is the fiction in this issue? Not because of my story, but what Laura also acquired was the first serial excerpt from Mona Simpson's remarkable first novel, Anywhere But Here. Yeah. Now, this is also an important historic issue, not because I'm in it or Mona's in it. Cosmo has this reputation of being kind of a sexy magazine. There's a period when Walmart wouldn't put them on the front registers, but only one time has Cosmo had frontal nudity. Of course, it is this issue, the issue that I'm in, the now infamous Build Your Better Bust Breast issue. My mother was so proud. Anyway, Laura, thank you. Also, historically, and I had never made this connection until this book tour.
Right.
This is the first time I ever wrote across gender.
Well, there you go.
And it was the first time I ever sold anything.
But you also did your homework. I mean, this brings us back to everything comes back to the research, right? Like you can't. I mean, yes, the emotional terrain is there, and of course, you have your wife, and you can take notes and all of that kind of thing. But you still kind of have to do the work.
You do have to do the work. You have to do the homework to make it accurate. And one of the weird, perhaps, blessings as a writer in my life is this. I am Armenian, and I do believe in intergenerational trauma. I do believe that whatever my grandparents endured has been passed down through my father to me. That's one blessing as a writer. And then I've got this other weird blessing as a writer. At one point, I went to 5 schools in 6 years in 3 states.
Oh, wow.
So I was always the new kid on the block trying to observe and figure out the culture. What am I supposed to dress and wear and how to behave? And Fitzgerald talks a lot about a writer being that individual with his or her, their fingers pressed against the glass, looking through the window inside at the party they weren't invited to. And that was a lot of my life after 6th grade.
Also, pre-internet, it was harder to figure that stuff out. Like, I remember going to the library and finding Rolling Stone and, all of these things where I was like, oh, the Village. I was not in New York at the time, but Village Voice at the library, I was like, oh, who are these people? My tribe. If they made a biopic about you, who would you want to play you, and would Grace Experience pick?
Would Grace Experience pick who should
the
play?
Person.
Okay, Grace Experience, you're on the spot. Who's going to play your dad? The answer is Brad Pitt, but you can...
Oscar Isaacs, can we have him? Okay, that's my pick.
I'd love to see Oscar
Okay.
Isaacs do that. Thank you.
And I'm always nosy, even though right now my reading is slightly dictated by the show. I agreed to read Middlemarch for an event. I have a giant post-it on my monitor at the office that just says Middlemarch. I have until April 10th. It's 738 pages. And I promised I'd do it. What are you reading right now?
Oh my gosh. I am in love with Broken Country. Absolutely fantastic. It is just one of the most moving, powerful books.
It's very you.
Thank you.
It's very you, that book.
Thank you. I loved Karen Slaughter's most recent Mystery in the Will Trent series. This is Why We Lied. I love Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Message. I have to give a shout out to Going Home by, I think it is Tom Pattinson. It is a beautiful yellow book with a polar bear on the cover.
Oh, yeah.
Just love that. It's about 3 men and a rabbi trying to raise a little boy after mom has killed herself, and it's
Right.
just sweet and lovely and smart. So those are immediately off the top of my head. But I will tell you that I'm also clearly in love with Irish literature right now. Whether it's Carolyn O'Donoghue's The Rachel
Right.
Incident, Sally Rooney's Intermezzo, I just constantly find myself gravitating to these books.
The bee sting. You need the bee sting.
Okay.
I promise you. I know. It's huge. And the voices,
Okay.
You need the bee sting. You will fly through 600 plus pages. I promise. You will not even know what happened.
I'm all in.
I mean, you will because it's a great book. But the point is that you will be done with 600 pages in a flash.
Okay. And I'll give one more shout out. Got to read The Stolen Queen by Fiona Davis.
There you go. So on that note, I think we need to sign some books. So I'm going to say thank you, New York. It was great to see you. We're here on the Barnes & Noble at the Upper West Side with Chris Bohjalian. And this is Poured Over, and I'm Miwa Messer. Thank you.
Thank you, Miwa. You're the best.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.